Welcome to my webinar on the development of parliamentary democracy in the UK from 1832. This webinar is based on a presentation that I've done for a number of organisations over the years, and I'm now making it available as a webinar on my website. So firstly, who am I? So my name is Jonathan Ellis. I've been a charity campaigner in the UK. I'm a two-time Westminster parliamentary candidate. I'm also a qualified history teacher, and my degree was in history, where my special subject was 19th century elections. And I'm going to try and bring all those four things together over the course of this short webinar. So in terms of an overview of the period, I'd argue that there's a strong tradition in the UK of civil society protest, yet there was never any real revolution, with the period in particular after 1815 being a defining period of change accentuated by the Industrial Revolution and two world wars in the 20th century. In terms of early developments, a few things to note. Obviously in 1215, the Magna Carta, or the Great Charter of Freedoms. And when we talk about freedoms, we're not talking about the freedoms of ordinary men and women. This is really around the freedoms of the barons, of the nobility, and their relationship to the king. We then have the English Civil War, 1642 to 51, which is the defining battle between the role of the king and the role of Parliament. And then kind of emerging from that in 1689, we have the important Bill of Rights, which both limits the power of the king and also is around guaranteeing freedom of speech. And in terms of early protests, I think it's important just to note some of the early protests throughout the history of the UK. In 1381, there was the Peasants' Revolt, where people rose up against what was seen to be the unfair poll tax. In 1549, the Kett Rebellion, which was protests against the enforced enclosure of land. My own favourite, the Levellers. What a great name, the Levellers, who basically wanted to level the whole of society to the same level. And linked to that, the Diggers. And the Diggers got their name because they wanted a farm on common land. We see the Luddite outbreaks in the early kind of 19th century. And these were protests at the emergence of new technology, which was threatening jobs. And then in 1816, there's the Sparfields riot, followed 3 years later in 1819 with the Peterloo massacre. Both of those were protests around the lack of ability to vote, basically. And I'd argue that the Peterloo massacre in 1819, people gathering in St Peter's Field in Manchester, protesting about the lack of the right to vote, where 15 people were killed and 400 to 700 people were injured when the yeomanry kind of invaded the protest. That was a low point in British history. And really what I'm going to do now from that low point is really kind of go on from 1832, and I'll explain the significance of 1832 to the present day in terms of the key developments in the parliamentary democracy in the UK. So if we go back to the year of 1832 and look at the state of the franchise, by which I mean basically who could vote. And from the year 1432, only people with property worth 40 shillings could vote. Now that was a significant sum at that time. From that period, there were then some changes, but there was no major reform of who could actually vote until 1832. And then in the year 1832, where we do see some reform. But at that time, just 3% from a population of 8 million people could vote, just 3%. And there was a real challenge, particularly in terms of the problem of rotten boroughs. And the classic, which is often cited, is the constituency of Old Sarum in Wiltshire. In 1831, it had the grand total of 11 voters. So parliamentary reform. Over the period from 1832, we see a number of parliamentary reform acts, changes to the number of people, basically, who could vote in the UK. In 1832, the Great Reform Act, where we see 1 in 7 men with property could now vote. Now, it's important to note that's just men, but men with property. We have the Second Reform Act in 1867, where the number of people who could vote was increased again, and this time it was men in urban areas, again with property. A really important development in 1870, really important, was the Ballot Act, which was the introduction of the secret ballot. Now, I guess we take for granted the fact that when we vote, our vote is secret. No one knows how we vote. But prior to 1870, the way you voted was a matter of public record. It was actually recorded the way that you voted. I think that's a really significant change in 1870. And in 1884, we have another change, another increase to people who could vote, the Representation of the People's Act. But it's still really important to know that still 40% of men were unable to vote. And of course, women at this stage could not vote. In 1918, after the Great War, the First World War, we see the 1918 Representation of the People's Act. And now all men over 21 could vote, and with no property qualification. And now 40% of women could vote. They had to be over 30, and they had to have property. And what we saw in 1918 was an increase in number of people who could vote from 7.7 million to 21.4 million. And then 10 years later, in 1928, we have another Representation of the People's Act, and now all men and women over the age of 21 could vote. And then in 1969, which brings us really to where we are now, I guess, another Representation of the People's Act, and basically all men and women over the age of 18 could vote. In terms of other dates, just to go through in terms of our kind of development, our kind of parliamentary development, in 1973, the United Kingdom joined what was then the European Economic Community. 1974 was a really interesting year where we had two elections. The first election produced a hung parliament, and then we then get a minority Labour administration after the second election of that year. In 1975, there was a referendum on our membership of the European Economic Community. In 1979, interestingly, there were referendums on devolution in both Scotland and Wales, and there was quite a high threshold for the majority that was needed. And on that occasion, neither referendum succeeded in getting to the majority that was required by Parliament. Other developments in the 1990s, we see developments of local government. Historically, we'd have a kind of difference between boroughs and counties, and we have an emergence of unitary authorities, where you would have a local authority managing all of the services for a particular area. Another significant date in 1997, we see now successful devolution, successful referendums leading to devolution for both Scotland and Wales. The year after, the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, really significant agreement there in terms of bringing peace, but also bringing devolved government in Northern Ireland. In 1999, we have European Union elections, and they are done by proportional representation. I'll come back to this point, but quite an interesting development. In the UK, we'd always had first past the post, winner takes all, and in 1999, it was the first kind of experiment, really, using the single transferable vote and the D'Hondt formula, but I won't bore you with those details. But essentially, a greater degree of proportionality. It wasn't just the winner taking all, and there were multi-member constituencies, not just one member per constituency. Also in the same year, we have more elected mayors, executive mayors. We have the Mayor of London elected, and after 99, more mayors being elected. My favourite example was in Hartlepool, where Hangus the Monkey, who was the mascot of the local football team, got elected. But on a more serious note, we did see more power being transferred to directly elected mayors. In 2004, there was a regional referendum in terms of giving more devolved power to the northeast of England, but that was rejected by the voters. I think a sense that people just didn't want another level of government. People couldn't see the value to it. And then in the kind of the 15 years, 2001, 2015, we see attempts at reform of the House of Lords. The UK has always had two houses of Parliament, the House of Commons and the House of Lords. It's called a bicameral legislature. And there was an attempt by the then Labour government to reform, indeed, and also by the coalition government. And probably the most notable thing during that period is the removal of the hereditary peers, people who sat in the House of Lords because of their family connection. Although it should be stated, of course, whilst most hereditary peers were removed, 92 were still allowed to stay. And then other things to touch on briefly, 2010, coming more recently, we had the coalition government, the Conservatives not quite getting enough to run the country, and the Liberal Democrats coming into coalition government. In 2012, as one of the Lib Dem conditions of going into government was a referendum on voting reform, an attempt to get a greater degree of proportionality, a slightly fairer voting. And that was put to the British people, but the British people rejected that attempt to change the way that we voted. In 2014, a Scottish referendum on independence, which was defeated. And then in 2016, we have the referendum on the UK's continued membership of the European Union, where a narrow majority, but a majority nonetheless of the British public, voted that the United Kingdom should withdraw from EU membership. And right to 2020, which is where I'm delivering this webinar now, we have the impact of COVID-19. And in particular, in terms of parliamentary democracy, we have the amazing innovation, I guess, of Parliament being conducted online, parliamentary questions being conducted by Zoom, and just last week, I think, the first parliamentary votes conducted not in the chamber, but online. So that brings us up to date. Just a few things to say about kind of campaigning in the period. I think there is a rich tradition of campaigning across the UK, and things that we should be really proud of, I think, in this country. Campaigns for justice, most notably the campaign to end slavery, hugely significant and important campaign. The campaigns around promoting the growth of rights in the workplace. The Tall Puddle Martyrs, and the growth of the trade union movement. The importance of the Chartist movement, and I'll come back and say a few more words about those, because I think that's a really significant development. The campaign against child labour. We would completely not accept child labour today, and a real vigorous, robust campaign against child labour. And of course, the suffragettes, the massively important campaigning movement to promote the case that women should have the right to vote. And I mentioned the Chartists. I just think it's a really interesting movement, kind of campaign in the 19th century. And I think their charter was really interesting, what they were calling for. They were calling for a vote for every man 21 years of age of sound mind. Note, every man, that is. They wanted the secret ballot, which I mentioned already, to protect the elector in the exercise of his vote. They wanted no property qualification for members, and they wanted payment of members, so that you could be independent. You didn't have to be wealthy to be a member of Parliament. They wanted equal constituencies, and really interestingly, they wanted annual parliamentary elections. Can you imagine that? An election to Parliament every year. And they argued that this presented the most effective check to bribery and intimidation. And then finally, just to wrap up this webinar, some issues around today. So we still, despite our experiment with European elections, we still have single-member constituencies, which means, for example, that if you are a Conservative voter in a Labour constituency, you may feel that you're not represented. Other systems have multi-members, so you might have members from different parties. But we've always had a single member, or in more recent times, a single member constituency. We still have first past the post. That's a system that we have always used, which is basically the best way to understand that is winner takes all. Even if you have just one more vote than the other candidate in second place, you will win. That sense of winner takes all. And the question of, is that the most democratic, the fairest way to conduct elections? But that's still what we have. We have a continued struggle over reform of the House of Lords. We have the House of Commons, which is democratically elected, and the House of Lords that's not. And in a democracy, is that right? People will argue that the House of Lords brings expertise and specialism, but what is the place of the House of Lords in a modern democracy? There's still a continued conversation and debate around the voting age, and we saw that in the European referendum. Is 18 right? Should it be 16? When people are leaving school, they're paying taxes, should they not have the right to vote? There's also a debate over the role of referendums, and particularly learning from the European Union referendum in 2016. We have no great tradition in this country of using referendums. We're not too sure where they sit compared to countries like Switzerland, for example, where referendums are really embedded in terms of how they do government. And I think we're still really unsure as to where referendums fit in our parliamentary democracy. Many people from outside the UK are amazed that we still don't have a written constitution. We have no rule book in terms of how Parliament and government works. We have the Cabinet Manual, which is a relatively recent innovation, which is well worth a look, which sets out how government works, but we have still no written constitution. And over more recent years, really since Tony Blair was Prime Minister, we've seen the number 10 operation, the Prime Minister's office being expanded, being increased, but this is still not a presidential system. We still have a government, and the Prime Minister is meant to be first amongst equals. And then the final point, which I think is a really interesting point, is the head of state. And of course, the head of state in the UK is not the Prime Minister. It's the Queen. It's the Queen. And every bill that becomes an act, that becomes law, has to go through the House of Commons, has to go through the House of Lords, but then it has to get royal assent. And interestingly, the Queen will use Norman French to give her assent for a bill to become an act. But still, that is the final part of the parliamentary process. So, I hope you found that webinar useful. It's a bit of a roller coaster tour through the development of parliamentary democracy in the UK. I just wanted, before I leave you, just share two websites in terms of more information on today. And two great accessible websites, which I think really enhance our democracy. The first is parliament.uk, which is basically all the information around Parliament, in the Lords, in the Commons, on your MPs, on debates. Absolutely brilliant resource in terms of finding out what your MP is doing, what your MP is speaking up on. And then there's parliamentlive.tv, where you can actually follow both debates in Parliament, but also committees as well. Well worth a look to keep up to date with our parliamentary democracy. Anyway, I hope you found this webinar useful, and thank you for listening.